Work Wellness Institute is transforming research into workplace performance and health. As an organization, we function throughout the complete cycle of turning research into practice, mobilizing knowledge as a research institute, community partner, funder, and educational provider. Our mission of creating safe, healthy, and inclusive workplaces for all is our driving motivation. Learning is a lifelong journey to adapt to the forever changing needs of the workplace. Whether you are a leader, a professional, an academic, or a student, we provide high-quality resources that are evidence-based, topical, and relevant to all industries. Choose the Work Wellness Institute as your learning journey partner and become a member to gain full access to our diverse knowledge mobilization programming, including lectures on demand, e-curriculum, 3 distinct certification opportunities, and more. Continue to learn and connect with the Work Wellness Institute and see how we can support transforming research into performance and health for your workplace.
Hello, good morning, afternoon, or perhaps even evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you so much to everyone who is taking the time to join us in today's webinar for Return to Work in Police Services Injured, Not Broken. My name is Elizabeth White, and I am the team lead of Learning and Development with the Work Wellness Institute, and I'll be here to help host and moderate today's webinar. I would like to start off by acknowledging that I have the privilege to live and work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. This webinar is made possible through the support of our funders, partners, as well as memberships to the Work Wellness Institute, and we would like to thank our advisory committees and speakers who contribute to this webinar series. And we are so excited to have Dr. Dwayne Van Eerd with us today. Dwayne is a scientist at the Institute for Work and Health, where he has been a researcher since 1997. He has both a master's and bachelor's of science in kinesiology from the University of Waterloo, a master's of science in health research methodology from McMaster University, and a PhD in work and health from the Faculty of Applied Health Sciences at the University of Waterloo. Upon getting his master's of science in kinesiology, Dwayne got his start in occupational health and safety research in a clinical setting studying musculoskeletal disorders, or short for MSDs, of the upper body in musicians, painters, writers, and other artists. Now a scientist with the Institute for Work and Health, he focuses primarily on the prevention of work-related injuries, as well as on the implementation of programs and practices to prevent work injury and disability related to physical and mental health. His research projects include evaluations of workplace MSDs and mental health practices and programs, as well as their implementation and systematic reviews of prevention literature. Dwayne also practices and researches integrated knowledge transfer and exchange. We're so excited to have you here. Thank you so much for spending this time with us, and I'll happily pass things over to you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And I want to thank the Work Wellness Institute for the opportunity to present on this research work about return to work in Ontario Police Services. The injured, not broken is something that will emerge as I speak a little bit later in this presentation. So I'd like to mention that this is about workplace practices. So it's applied or practical research. I'm presenting on behalf of a rather large research team from the Institute for Work and Health, as well as a member from the Public Services Health and Safety Association in Ontario. We worked closely with a group of stakeholders, police members from individual police services in Ontario, as well as members of the Ontario Association of Chiefs of Police, the Police Association of Ontario, the Ontario Provincial Police Association, and the Ontario Police Health and Safety Association. Funding for this research project was given by the Workplace Safety and Insurance Board in Ontario and their grants program. So today, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the research study, giving some sense of why we did it and our objectives. Very brief touch on how we collected and worked with the data, and spend most of my time talking about the results and the themes in particular. I have a little asterisk beside the literature review findings. You'll learn quickly why we are, in fact, updating those. So it'll be a very brief part of the presentation. I'll also spend a little bit of time on the practical guide that we developed based on the findings of this research project, along with our stakeholder group, and then finish off with some basics, I guess, about discussions about the research project, and give a summary to give you a chance to ask some questions. So the research study then, we were looking at return to work in police, and notice there's quite a knowledge gap regarding the practical aspects of return to work in police services. The peer-reviewed literature in previous reviews that we did about return to work did not contain, excuse me, many references to police or first responders or public safety personnel. And the other piece that was important to us is that workplace practices are typically not studied. I mean, there's intervention research, but they are most often developed by researchers or research teams or practitioners along with researchers. But the actual practices that are in place in workplaces are typically not studied in detail. So our objectives then were to collect and synthesize the current workplace return to work practices in Ontario Police Services, so that we can document and hopefully improve them. We gathered the perspectives of those who had experienced return to work. So a worker was somebody, or that's the label we used for somebody who was off work and had to return to work following an injury. And then we considered the manager, supervisor, or the OHS, or return to work, or disability managing practitioner, as somebody who has experience helping others in return to work in police services. I'll explain a little bit more about what those two numbers or two groups mean. So the way we gathered our information was primarily through the semi-structured interviews. We had 3 stages. And we did the interviews with police members directly. We were looking for both sworn and civilian, and we were asking about return to work practices and experiences. So we were really asking about, what does the workplace provide? What are the steps, and what are your experiences? We also looked at some return to work policy documents as they were available. But I'll just note that they were consistent with the interview theme, so I won't go into much detail about those. We also did a rapid review of the peer-reviewed literature on return to work in policing. The reason it's a rapid review is because we were building on a couple of systematic reviews that we had already done on return to work at the Institute for Work and Health. And then we brought those together, tried to synthesize these different evidences or practices into a practical guide, which I'll describe briefly at the end of this presentation. And then one more little methodsy thing. In general, we worked with our stakeholders throughout the research project, starting with the research question, wanting to make sure that we are asking a meaningful question and it's relevant and timely. We did approach our stakeholder committee for help in recruitment, providing us sometimes introductions or opportunities to recruit. And then when we had some preliminary results, we asked them to look at them with us and help us finesse or frame the messages. In other words, stakeholders did not change the results of the research, which was done by our research team, but they helped us to frame the messages in appropriate ways for the audiences. We also asked them to help us disseminate the results of the study, as well as the guide that we developed. So here's the meat of this presentation. The rapid review results were thin, as a good way to say it. We based our rapid review on systematic reviews about return to work, and we updated the literature to these reviews from about 2018 to 21. We were looking to answer the question, what workplace-based return to work and work disability management or support interventions are effective in assisting police? And we broadened that to work first responders, once we saw the numbers, with return to work after a period of work absence. The search was comprehensive, almost 8,500 references, but there were only 4 articles that were relevant to answering the question that we posed. 2 articles were specific to police, the other 2 were for fire. And we had one study that had a true return to work outcome where the others included sickness absence. So I say that because we were very inclusive, looking for anything that might support return to work in policing. I'll touch back on this in a moment as we are updating. We've updated the search and we're now looking to see if we can find some additional articles to those 4 that are relevant. So I'll focus now on the qualitative results or the interview results. We interviewed 49 police service members. We purposefully wanted to balance between participants that were male and female, had the different roles, either experienced return to work themselves or supported somebody with return to work. And we just used the label manager versus worker in that. We also purposefully looked for a balance between sworn and civilian members and those with different injury types. I will note that we did not expect that the combination would be the largest group. We were looking to balance between physical and psychological injuries. So 49 people told us their experiences with return to work, and we did a thematic analysis of the interview data. So we had 5 overarching themes that emerged from the data. There were 2 themes that were related to context and culture, which tended to highlight the specific challenges to return to work in Ontario policing. And I'll reiterate here, we asked about return to work practices. We did not specifically ask about context or culture, but this is what emerged when we were asking about those return to work practices. Within the context, we heard that return to work can be challenging post-injury. Not surprising, also not different than many other sectors. We also heard that the injuries that police service members can get are complex, and whether they're physical or psychological. So we did hear a great deal of detail about the types of injuries experienced. Within the culture of police services, we heard the phrase chain of command many, many times in the interviews. So it's a hierarchical culture. We heard about stoicism. And while stoicism is not necessarily a bad thing, the part that seemed to emerge most often is that injury was equated with weakness. And again, I'll mention a little bit more about that as we move on. That also linked with the stigma. The stigma of being injured seemed to be very prominent in the data as we were asking about the return to work journeys and experiences. So this is the quote that best, I think, represents the context and culture. In my role, I have lots of meetings with senior management. They have a whiteboard in their offices with all the people who are off sick on WSIB or other illnesses, and they call them broken toys. Those are the broken toy people, and they talk about what they're going to do with them, how they're going to get them back to do menial jobs like counting paper clips and things. So when I went back, that's what I felt like a broken toy. So this is where the title of the presentation came from. The concept of being broken, damaged, emerged over and over again in the interviews that we had with people who were injured and off work. So there's a cultural element there that's difficult. So there were also the additional 3 themes of the 5 that I mentioned were what we called return to work practice themes. These were accommodation, communication, and trust building. This image is how we've represented these themes and how they interact with each other. In other words, the context and culture is where return to work takes place. Accommodation, communication, and trust are the elements of practice that occur within that context and culture. I'll reprise that at the end, and hopefully it'll help with any questions that you may have. Accommodation had 2 sub-themes. One was about time and effort to recover, not traditionally considered accommodation, but it was so prominent in our interviews that we decided we needed to capture it. And so it's like the precursor to accommodation. There were lots of effort to recover, but there was also burden of paperwork and bureaucracy that people talked about. This worker indicated the goal number 1, get better. Number 2, get back to work. In fact, the says the goal number 1 is to get back to work. And the person repeated himself. And wait, get better first, then get back to work. I was doing therapy once or twice a week. I did everything, maxed out my benefits, did massage, hot yoga, doing acupuncture, I was trying everything. Seeing a naturopath, trying to get better, it was exhausting. This was a story we heard often. There was lots of effort put into returning to work. There were, however, also a sub-theme about accommodation challenges. This reflected the concept of meaningful work, people wanting to get back to their original role and not always thinking that a temporary role was meaningful work. But there was also challenges in finding that accommodated work based on the medical restriction of the individuals. So this manager talked about, we try our best to put people in positions where they're going to be most useful and get them back to work as soon as possible. But we're not a large police service that would have countless desk positions. We have to kind of figure that out each time, what would be best based on their injury. This quote was selected as representative because of the words desk positions. This was the most often position that was not considered meaningful work by many of our participants. So I mentioned that because that seemed to be the challenge of finding accommodated work. The other theme about communication also had two sub-themes. There was one about genuine, timely communication, and the other was about clarity and consistency of the return to work process. What was striking about the responses and the experiences of return to work around communication was people wanted to know more about what the process was. What are the steps involved? And there's often multiple people involved in a return to work process. But there was also this element of wanting the communication to be supportive rather than adversarial. This manager said, one thing we were trying to do is keep people connected when they're out of the workplace, because we've had feedback from many people to say, when I was out of the office, I didn't feel I was part of the organization. I felt disconnected. Nobody cared. So that sense of being disconnected was prominent. And there was also a number of people who talked about the adversarial communication, which also fit into this not caring. They were talking about just having a checklist. They didn't really care whether I was doing better or not. The other part was about clarity and consistency of the return to work process. Balance between flexibility and consistency seemed to be the element here. And that was particularly true in those who had suffered a psychological injury. So this worker said, I found that being off on a physical injury, those policies made sense. But when I was off on a mental health related injury, those policies didn't work that well. It felt like I was trying to fit a mental health issue into a physical issue. There's lots of information about if you break a bone, you're going to be back to work in 6 weeks or so. It's fairly standard. Psychological health or psychological injuries may not follow as clean a path or as consistent a path. And so there was this challenge that people, both of workers and managers, talked about how to communicate this in a meaningful way. Communication is common in many of the return to work, qualitative studies about return to work, but this was very specific about process. And the last return to work practice theme was about trust and trust building. There were 3 sub-themes here: lack of confidentiality, perceived malingering, and lack of trust, outright lack of trust. They all played together in an interesting way. What I'll mention here is the quotes, because if you know anything about police service, nothing is secret. Everybody tells everybody everything, even though it's private. Everybody knows everything. Many people remarked on not having that confidentiality, not even about their own injury. So they didn't convey, and there's no need to convey their diagnosis or injury. But they found out that many people seem to know about it. And this links to the lack of trust at the theme as well, or sub-theme as well. So I'll mention that in a moment. There's also this concept of perceived malingering. This worker said, they kept talking about how they kept seeing me in the gym. I looked good again, but I'm just using the system. I wanted to go back so much, But then all that stuff got back to me about how everybody kept thinking I was beating the system or taking advantage of the system, which isn't the case. And this person actually delayed their return to work because they were so upset about being thought of as a malingerer. So the stigma, this part of the culture actually delayed this person to go back to work. There was nothing helpful about having that label by managers or by the coworkers as well. And then lastly, this lack of trust. This was often directed at HR or wellness and disability management, which was often connected with HR. And this quote sums it up very nicely. This worker says, "There's also the fear of if you go, then you may never get promoted or get moved to another unit or another job. They say they don't hold it against you, but more times than not, when you look at other people who get promoted and get moved around, the ones who went off or were suffering with something never get moved." This fear was palpable in our interviews, and it was almost always about their career. It wasn't always about the fear of, not getting better. It was mostly about not getting promoted or not getting opportunities in their career to move forward, which is where I think it was most often directed towards that sort of HR element of the police services. Okay, so I think I'm doing even better for time than I had imagined. So I'm going to slow down just a little bit because this is how we pulled it all together. So we took those findings from the themes and looked at the research literature. So the rapid review yielded these 4 intervention studies that were relevant to return to work. There were 2 from police, 2 from firefighters, and as I mentioned, 1 was return to work and 3 had sickness absence. So they were all different studies, which restricted our ability to synthesize them into kind of one thing. So what we did is we fit the study findings with the themes that emerged for this practical guide. And then we use the themes as our organizing frame, if you will, to set up this guide. And we hope it continues to be practical for those that are doing return to work in policing. I should mention that the guide is freely available on our IWH website. And we have been distributing it since, I don't know exactly when, since the end of 2022, I think. So the front page is really describing where this came from, with as little methodological detail as possible. So we don't turn people off, of course. Researchers like methods, but not everybody does. Where the information comes from, and we're very specific, it comes from this resource project, or sort of this research project, and who should use it and our copyright. So we've used that symbol that we created that represents, and then use this phrase ACT, because it seemed to fit very well with the way the themes emerged. So we have a page about accommodation. We list the challenges that we heard about, provided some supporting quotes going beyond what I was able to present in this particular webinar, and then give suggested actions. These actions came from that synthesis of the research literature, but also the recommendations of the individuals that we spoke to. So there were many people who provided their thoughts about their experiences, and we built upon those recommendations in this particular guide. So one example is approach the return to work plan and reintegration with flexibility and an understanding that return to work process may not strictly follow an anticipated trajectory, especially for members with a psychological injury. So this is that element of wanting to know about the accommodation process, and that there may not be this straightforward, always moving forward plan, if you will. And that's particularly true for the psychological injuries. And we did hear a lot about how those steps can sometimes be repeated, and also sometimes quite overwhelming for individuals as they go through their return to work journey. Next, we have the last 2 pages, I think, of the guide. Then there's a communication page, again, challenges, quotes, and these suggested actions. See what we did there? That's the actions. One is injured workers can be overwhelmed by the return to work process, therefore ensure communication is clear. Include information about how the process and accommodations may differ depending on injury type and individual circumstances, and adapt the mode of communication to the circumstances. So this came primarily from those individuals with psychological injuries who felt sometimes overwhelmed or burdened by the paperwork or the need to respond to different types of communications, especially when they thought it was just a checklist. Nobody's really caring about me, but they need this information. Sometimes that can be triggering. Sometimes that can be daunting if you have a psychological injury. And so one of the key recommendations that many people talked about was alter the communication, maybe an email so that I can respond to it in the time that I can. Sometimes it's nice to have a phone call, text messages. Again, there's these different ways to communicate, which were considered to be important in not just the communication, but also in the return to work process, the accommodation process. And so this emerged a lot in our interviews, as I said. And then trust. Trust building was an important element. It was mentioned, as I said, within culture, within the context, and it was considered very important for the benefit of return to work to have a trusted relationship or trusted communication. So this particular action is about ensuring all communications about injuries are respectful and use non-stigmatizing language that does not equate with injuries, does not equate injuries with weakness or being damaged or broken. I'll say again, broken toy was perhaps the phrase we heard most often in these interviews. And it clearly reflected the stigma and somewhat the stoicism element of the culture within police services. So that's the guide. And now just a little bit about the research study and where we came to. So there are some strengths of this research study. We had a strong stakeholder involvement. They were involved throughout the project. We gathered the perspectives directly from those people who experienced return to work in police services, whether they experienced the return to work process themselves or whether they supported others with return to work. And I have to say the interviews yielded very rich and very complex data for us to deal with and present in hopefully this relatively simple way or understandable way. There are limitations. We do note it's a convenient sample. We did, purposefully select those balances between male and female and sworn and civilian, etc. There's always the possibility there's some selection bias in those that volunteer to participate in an interview. But I will say that the themes that emerged are representative of both the manager or workplace person as well as the workers. There wasn't anything that really was only mentioned by one of those groups. So we feel we have a reasonable sample to represent these findings. We also have some underrepresentation of the small police services. We reached out to, but many had few return to work experiences and therefore declined to participate in the study. And as I mentioned, there are few peer-reviewed studies on return to work in policing or first responders for that matter. We are aware, though, that there is an increase in that literature in the last couple of years, which is why we are we researched the literature and are updating our rapid review. Probably now it is going to be a full review, depending on the numbers. But we have an additional 7,000 references to look at, just to give you a little bit of insight as to where that is, and it will take a little bit of time to get that going or done, as it were. And so The themes that were generated or emerged from these data reveal overlap with previous qualitative return to work research. Accommodation, communication, and trust are often mentioned. But as I noted throughout, there were some unique aspects of policing within these themes, particularly around communication and trust. And I think the balance between the processes or return to work practices for physical and psychological injuries generated a lot of that element, if you will. So to keep myself in work, I always have to recommend that there's more research needed. But here I actually have a little bit of evidence behind that because there are a few studies out there on return to work in police or first responders. Emerging ideas around reintegration programs. Many of the services that we spoke with were in the process of looking at or adapting reintegration programs for the return to work. We didn't hear a lot about them because they were very early days during the pandemic when we were doing our interviews. And there is a little bit more work I think needs to be done with the coordination with the compensation and insurance system. Within Ontario, where is all I can speak about for this research study, we often heard individuals say they didn't understand how the compensation system was going to help them in return to work. Many actually exhibited surprise that they would have wage replacement during their time off of work. So that's how little they knew about how the insurance or compensation system worked. So more research, I think, or more work needed in that area as well. So to summarize, and the main part of this research, I think, are the qualitative research. So there were 5 overarching themes, and this is how we visually represented them. Return to work can be challenging, injuries can be complex. We know that the culture of police services tend to be hierarchical. There is stoicism and stigma. The stigma is the element that really needs to be worked on in this return to work area. There were certainly challenges related to accommodation, related to the recovery, meaningful work, and the positions available. Communication, there was a need for genuine, timely communication, and certainly clear and consistent messages or clear and consistent communication about the return to work process. And then there was this element of trust, a certain lack of confidentiality, this element of considering people as malingerers, and overall distrust about the workplace seemed to be an important finding in our research. So I want to do a couple of acknowledgements. First of all, thank you, a big thank you to our stakeholder committee and the interview participants for this study. I'll mention again that the research was supported by funding from the WSIB, Workplace Safety and Insurance Board of Ontario. And I have to mention that the Institute for Work and Health operates with the support of the province of Ontario, but the views represented in this presentation are mine and may not necessarily reflect those of the province of Ontario. This is here to, if you want to keep up on other evidence-based practice from the Institute for Work and Health, there's a number of ways to get it. And I added a little piece on the right side here about a new project that I'm involved in with the Institute for Work and Health, where we are doing a project ECHO, which is a community, community of practice for practitioners who deal with returning public safety personnel to work. It's been exciting, and if you want to know more about it, there's a link there that you can click on once the presentation is posted. And if you want any further information about this research project or other projects that I'm doing with first responders, I have some projects that are going on in other parts of Canada right now, please email me and I'm happy to respond. Then what I'll do is go back to this summary picture and leave it up for questions. It may help spark some questions or comments. I'm very happy to take any questions or comments at this time. Elizabeth.
Hey, thank you so much for that presentation and such a rich amount of information for a very complex work industry, I would say. So I'll just remind everyone that we have both the question and answer as well as chat function. So please utilize both as you're thinking of your questions or perhaps typing away at the moment. But I will kick things off with our first question here around you mentioned that there was a specific sorry, let me just look at this again. Yes, so there was kind of a specific intent to have a equitable as much as possible between a male and female um, kind of interview group. And so the question here is, did you find any differences from that specific gendered lens? Was there a particular, any other sub-themes that came out with the differences between male or female for the return to work process?
Oh, that's a great question. We did not look for those differences because the objective of the project was to gather the broader experience. Um, I can say that in the analysis, there was nothing emergent, nothing that we thought was important to comment on. Um, there is there was a comment by one of our participants that talked about sort of a hierarchy where they talked about sworn, civilian, male, female, and all the combinations there within, and had their idea about how that hierarchy played out in a police service.
Mm-hmm.
But beyond that, and that was a powerful uh, reminiscence or experience, but beyond that, there was nothing that really emerged. But of course, we didn't set up to look for it explicitly either.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. The next question is when participants referenced a lack of clarity on associated policies to return to work, were they referring to employer-specific policies or perhaps just to provide a bit of clarity? When they're looking for clarity, what are the policies that they felt really lacked that in the return to work policy?
Yeah, it was a bit of both, in the sense, and by both I mean both the policy that was available, but also the information that was communicated throughout the process.
Hmm.
So we were asking about policies. The policies tended to be written at a high enough level that that was not maybe confusing, but it wasn't also always enlightening about what was going to happen in a practice sense. What's the next step that I need to take? And therefore, there was that communication required to know, where do I go next? What do I do next? And that was particularly noted by those with psychological injuries. And many of our participants mentioned that they had more difficulty in understanding, and that may have been due to the injury they had suffered. But that they felt that there was a different level of consistency between the procedures or practices for physical than for psychological. So that seemed to be where the lack of clarity about process came from. The participants rarely mentioned the policy outright. It was more about the
Hmm.
day-to-day communication and practice elements.
Yes, that I can understand that, and I imagine, as is the case in so many, where you read a policy when you were first onboarded
Yes.
somewhere, 7 or however many years has gone by, and did you what does how much did you retain from that one policy?
Yeah,
And
that's
I do.
often mentioned in qualitative research about return
Mhm.
to work too. And that is it's a function of, you don't look at it until you need it.
Right.
Unfortunately, when you need it, you may not be able to understand it in the same way. And therefore
Yes.
the guidance and communication is why that's important.
Well, and I think that distinction between, as we know, just in the nature of a physical injury, there is usually a clear path of recovery
Right.
as we know those milestones and things, whereas the psychological is very different. And just following up on that communication, did you find communication that really did end up being helpful or meaningful? As you mentioned, quite a few participants mentioned it just was checking a box. It really wasn't helping me. It felt kind of burdensome. did anybody identify, well, this communication was actually helpful and that aided my process?
Yes, yes, we did hear. I should have mentioned that earlier too. We had over the 49 sort of experiences, there were positive and negative. It wasn't all so we didn't get only those individuals that joined our study that wanted to complain or had a terrible experience. We had a good balance actually of good experiences and not so good experiences. So there were individuals who talked about when they had a good relationship with the other person, so whether they were a supporter or a worker, that seemed to help the level of communication, because of course I think there were shortcuts that can be taken then, and that also reflected in the trust. So trusted communication was an element here. So there were people that talked about having regular communication, and most often what they talked about being most helpful was when there was some consideration or genuine interest in how they were doing. When the communication included that, that almost always precipitated a more positive, both in terms of their understanding of the process and the consistency they felt that their program or their practice took. So that seemed to be one of the key factors, is that sort of genuine kind of communication versus we need this now, check this box or select this item, and then they don't hear from that person again for via email or phone or anything for an indeterminate amount of time. So one of the recommendations was that there was some negotiation of how frequent to have that communication, and in those instances when the communicator was sensitive to that, that seemed to also be a positive.
Yeah, I think that brings a good point too. Obviously, structure and policy is so imperative, but then also flexibility for individual circumstance. And not to put words in anyone's mouth, but I imagine that genuine communication provides a feeling of someone else is in it with me a little bit, less isolating perhaps when you get that genuine, how are you before I do need this from you, but like let's talk with you first.
Yeah, no, that could be it. That could be a part of it.
Hmm.
It's a good observation.
Yeah, wonderful. So just switching gears a little bit to kind of future, we do have a question here about the plan to disseminate this information. So I know you mentioned that you have the guide on the Institute for Work and Health website, but is there kind of any formal plans or anything that someone can follow up on in terms of disseminating this information across first responders, police services?
We're always looking for opportunities to disseminate it further. We've tried to reach out via some newsletters and with the different associations that were our partners. We've certainly had some good uptake of the guide. The full report is also available on the website, so there's that element as well for those that wish to have more detail. We're always looking for those opportunities to disseminate it further. It is it is Ontario specific, and that's where the research was from.
Hmm.
But in a few opportunities to present more nationally and in other provinces, and among different first responders, I've had lots of feedback to suggest this fits rather well with those different jurisdictions and different first responders. So we're always looking for opportunities to disseminate it further. This, of course, being one of those opportunities.
Yes, absolutely. And hopefully, those, again, this has been recorded, so perhaps an opportunity there as well to share recordings later on. So actually, just kind of going off of another question that you kind of started with a great transition into is other sectors. So just through all of the research, all of your expertise, you've obviously, been in this space for different industries and things. Were there findings you found that could be quite applicable to aiding the return to work process in police services from other sectors, or do you find that this is such a unique type of work that it really does need its kind of own set of guidelines and practices and etc.?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are certainly elements in most sectors that touch on accommodation, communication, and the need for trust among the partners. Return to work is usually, something that includes multiple different parties or people, whether that's the healthcare system, the compensation system, the workplace, family members, sometimes broader community, coworkers, so that element is consistent among most sectors in that they're always going to be mentioning those key things. What seems to be most different is where I think the trust element, this seems to be much more focused on career rather than the return to work process. That was not something we saw in other sectors as much. The element of accommodation and meaningful work was another thing that was, it's not absent from other sectors, but in a sworn member's view, to sit at a desk was really not meaningful. Return to work can have a lot of interesting complications about returning to the original position, especially if use of force is part of the journey back to return to work. So there's those very specific elements about policing that are different than other sectors. And I think maybe, and I'm leading up to this on purpose, but the biggest thing was most individuals that talked about, regardless of whether they were sworn or civilian, by the way, but they talked about the need to protect the public. And their recovery and accommodation to get back to work, one of their biggest concerns that we heard was, I need to know that I can protect the public, and often in the same breath, protect my partner, so the person that I'm working with. So that reflects a bit of a sworn perspective, but those that are dispatch and take calls have a similar feel for that need to be able to do their job to protect the public broadly. So I'd say that if you consider that like safety sensitive, the public safety, that is one of the biggest differences between this and other sectors.
That's a powerful perspective to bring forward. That is not certainly in everybody's return to work journey or a part of a job description. That's
Right.
quite unique to this sector. So another question coming in. So the great thing is that this conversation is creating thought, as our audience member has said. The last question has got me thinking
That's great.
about BC healthcare industry. So I know this was Ontario, but again, we
Mhm.
are in a national audience here, so that's great. Thinking about BC healthcare industry and the element of peer-based support through the journey. Has this been tried in policing? Kind of, maybe there's a liaison that helps them that's maybe not a part of the structure of HR or compensation or things like that. Just to see, was that a part of it, or perhaps a part of recommendations that you discussed?
So that is something that's happening a great deal in public safety personnel now, peer support, and a national organization, and I won't be able to say what the acronym stands for, but CIPCERT, is one of the best resources to look up about the kinds of different peer support and other support for first responders and public safety personnel. Sorry, yeah. The let me get my thoughts back here. We heard about those elements of peer support, but not consistently across all of the members that were participants in this study. And I think that has a lot to do with, well, actually, let me reframe that. It has something to do with the fact that some of the police services were looking at this concept of reintegration, which tends to then have those elements of peer support or have many different elements in the return to work journey. but it hadn't been established firmly in any of the police services that we spoke with. Rather they were worker or manager, we didn't hear that that was firmly ensconced. Since that time, and my opportunity to speak with other police services and other of the association members, I know that that is moving forward and rather rapidly. So I think if we did the study now, we might hear some more information about that. And I think nationally, I'm beginning to hear that as well, that there's more emphasis. But also a bit of a warning that I think CIPSRT would enjoy me to say is that there is evidence needed. We need to know what the evidence about how effective peer support is. In another study, I can tell you that it does not always work for everyone. It's not the perfect solution. And that's preliminary right now. I can't say very much more about it.
No, I think that's a bit of also an interesting dichotomy to what you were expressing, that there was actually issues with colleagues and what the perception is
Right.
of returning to work. And there was an example you used of a particular person that it hindered their return to work. So it would, out of my own curious mind, it would be interesting to see where does peer support play into helping or not, or if it has anything, which leads into that next question directly regarding the kind of collegial element to this return to work. And so the question here is, so what do we do? So for leaders, how can we communicate to team members so not crossing that confidentiality line that you mentioned is an issue? However, creating a forum of support and trying to bust maybe stigma that's happening so that it can foster a healthy return to work for someone and coming back into a team culture.
Yeah, that is a huge challenge. It's actually quite a challenge in almost all sectors. In some of the other qualitative return to work studies, the co-worker challenge is huge. So we have the situation where many workplaces are working with the minimum staff possible. Healthcare comes to mind, of course, but I think it's across all sectors. And so when somebody is off work injured, there can be these feelings of a coworker thinking what's going on, or feeling abandoned, or just feeling the extra load of work. And that can lead to some confrontation sometimes, and bad feelings. And it does then at times also, come to that point of, is this a malingering situation? Are they really just taking a break, and stuff like that? So that is across sectors. I think the element within policing is, again, it goes back to this public safety protection, needing to protect both the public, but also my partner. So that raises the bar quite a bit in that respect. I wish that there was a solution that emerged from this study, because it's so prevalent. But I don't have an answer for that. What to do? Yeah, treat everybody with respect, be confidential. That and of course that's what people try to do. So I'm not saying anything new here. Um, I'm just a researcher, remember that.
No, very nice. I think it's again just continuing conversation, hopefully, and being open to individual versus kind of blanket solutions. Perhaps again, I'm not an expert either, and to create a magic bullet solution that I'm sure we're all looking for in some of these circumstances. We'll just wrap here with a final question, again, in kind of a difference in experience, if you found any through the interviews, as there are both the injuries that expect a full return to work, and then there's other injuries that are, potentially career changing. It's never going to be, full capacity again. And just a question there of did that emerge, or did those differences in experience come to light in this particular research?
We did have those experiences represented in our interviews. Lots of interesting challenges from both the worker perspective as well as the workplace perspective. In a couple of instances, it was very much a success story where the journey to a new meaningful work did occur. It was not quick. I think that's the key element. And I think one of the important things that I might mention about that as well is that it had occurred for both physical and psychological injury. So it is possible, but there is more work required in those circumstances, and that was clear in the experiences of the workplace practices require even more flexibility in those cases. We did not hear a great deal from our participants about the workers' compensation role in that. But on a few occasions, that was also mentioned as not always being a facilitator. So, again, this concept of having multiple parties involved in a return to work journey means that there's a lot going on in that respect. The more complicated or complex the injury, we did reflect overall, did have, there were just more barriers. There were more needs, more communication required, different accommodation, more flexibility, I think is maybe the best way to sum it up.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I think we've started and ended in that same vein of this is complex. What a
Yes.
complex area,
Mhm.
and I want to thank you so much for sharing your expertise, and hopefully this has, gleaned some great insight. It already started some conversation today and some thought-provoking questions, which is so wonderful to see. And yeah, just again, I want to thank you for sharing your expertise and this research with our audience today. And of course, to our audience for being here and being so participatory as well.
Yes, thank you.
If you are a Work Wellness Institute member, just as a reminder, a certificate of attendance will be provided to you automatically, so not to worry about that. And if you're interested in learning more about us or joining us in further programming, again, you can visit us at workwellnessinstitute.org and click on the courses or resources section.
Continue to learn and connect with the Work Wellness Institute and see how we're transforming research into workplace performance and health at www.workwellnessinstitute.org.